For our listeners, this is a content warning. Throughout this podcast, we touch on subjects related to trauma, misogyny, racism and medical racism, sexual misconduct, residential schools, as well as many aspects of death and dying. Should you need them, there is a list of resources in our show notes. Most importantly, as you listen, take a break when you need to, and please take care of yourselves. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast is produced and recorded across the land known as Canada. These traditional and treaty territories are full of rich Indigenous histories, home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and MAiD peoples. We embrace the opportunity to share this story in a respectful, inclusive, and culturally appropriate way.
Hello, welcome to Before I Go. Before we introduce our amazing guest for today, I want to check in with you. How are you, Mom?
I'm good. I am really good. It's always nice when you feel sort of peace in your soul, peace in your heart. And I remind myself that, even though there are a lot of things going on, those moments that you can stop and take a breath, appreciate the little things, makes for a really good day. How are you, Danielle?
I'm good. There's a sense of being grounded, being present, being grateful. And when you're a daughter, when you're a caregiver, when you're a business owner, when you're a friend, when you're all of the things, life can feel chaotic, can feel like an emotional roller coaster you can't get off of. So when I have those moments of I'm here and I'm good, I treasure those moments, and yeah, I agree, that sense of peace, because I have a lot to be grateful for. We're going on new adventures. We have an amazing team and we get to meet amazing new people. Hi, Don. How are
Good
you?
morning. I'm pretty well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Really honored to be here for sure.
Can you introduce yourself?
Certainly. My name is Don Versluis. I am a nurse practitioner with Island Health. I am an assistant teaching professor at the University of Victoria in the nurse practitioner program. And I serve on the board of directors for CAMAP, the Canadian Association for Medical Assistance in Dying, Assessors and Provider, though I am not officially representing those organizations today. And very grateful to be with you both this morning.
Thank you so much for joining us. I actually saw your webinar with Dr. Adam Sandel.
Yes.
That's actually how I heard of you.
And I do know that he's been on your show before, so very flattered to be in such company.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, that was quite a while ago. When was that?
January of last year, wasn't it?
Time goes by so quickly. I struggle to give you a specific answer there.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds about right.
So we started this podcast, as mother, daughter, as patient and caregiver. Mom was diagnosed with pulmonary hypertension 8 years ago. But she's not the first one in our family to be diagnosed with it. We lost my Auntie Jerry, 14 years ago, 2 years after her diagnosis. So we're well-versed in how to be a patient, how to be a caregiver. And we saw the journey she took dealing with pulmonary hypertension, you know. And so when we were given the news that Mom has 5 to 7 years left, Mom, you made a choice. What was it?
I made the choice to use MAiD because I saw what my sister went through at the end of her life. At the end of pulmonary hypertension, and it's a long battle. It's progressive, and it strips you of everything in your life. My sister spent the last few months in bed, unable to do anything that brought her any kind of joy. And so I made that decision. I had contacted, rather, I had spoke to every member of my family. I sat my husband down, and he just immediately said, "Nope, nope." We had a long discussion around it. He went off to think, and then he came back and he said, "Okay, if that's what you want, you have my support." Then I sat down with each of my children. That was a difficult conversation to have because not everybody is ready for that conversation. So it just sort of gave me an idea of sort of how people see MAiD. And the person I was most worried about, the person, I consider to be the most sensitive, was the person that was most open to have a full conversation about it. My other family, my other children wanted to be supportive from the get go. And, I spoke to one of my children and she said, "Yeah, my friend's grandmother just did that." And it actually was a little bit, wasn't necessarily a smooth process. I can't really tell that story. It's not mine, but there were some delays that happened. And, this is all not even secondhand knowledge. This is third and fourth hand knowledge. So, I think part of what the issue with MAiD is you hear third, fourth, fifth hand knowledge as to people having issues with it. But I tend to think that if you're able to sit down and have a conversation one on one with people and they understand why you would choose that. Because one of the most difficult conversations I was expecting was with my father. And he is the most supportive. He gave me a hug and he said, "You know what? If I was facing the same thing, I'd choose it myself." And so, why do people, why are there so many miscommunications around MAiD? Because I don't think we're having enough of the conversation.
Mhm. And when we started this journey, it was very surprising to learn that, you know, we're trying to build this platform by putting an Indigenous lens on medical assistance in dying in Canada, because that conversation is not happening. You know, the MAiD report from a couple of years ago said, over 90% of people who use MAiD are Caucasian. Why aren't Indigenous people using it? Why aren't minorities using it? And in starting these conversations, in asking these questions, it brought up broad topics that we are still dealing with every single day. The medical racism, the systemic discrimination, the intergenerational trauma that comes with it, and with that comes a broken trust in a system that is hurting us. And so we wanted to have these conversations of what is MAiD, and we're so glad that you can join us today. What is your experience with MAiD?
Thank you for that question. I think my own experience with MAiD is unique, as I think all of the provider experiences are. I never thought, that is something I want to do. I never thought about MAiD until I was asked. And that happened in 2016. And I had not heard of it even at that time. And I had a patient ask me, and I sat down and talked to her about it to understand her experience. And that was my intro into MAiD. I looked into it. The process at that time was very prolonged because there weren't formalized policies yet within the organization. There certainly wasn't a lot of formalized policy around nurse practitioners doing that role. It was largely physicians, especially in the early days. And so my experience has really been so diverse, actually. And so I'm from Hamilton, Ontario, the lands of the Six Nations, the Grand River. And in that community, I found that people weren't nearly as open to MAiD as they were when I had moved out west here. And in fact, one of the draws for me to move out west was that my community of practice was out here. If we're speaking about my personal experience doing MAiD work, it really has been an immense privilege to be invited into such intimate moments of people's lives. I get to see the last words and the meaning making from people, and that is an immense privilege. That's something so few other people ever get to witness. And moving out to Vancouver Island, and so I'm now on the Lekwungen speaking people's lands, the Songhees Esquimalt peoples, on whose traditional territory I now live. And my experience in moving from Ontario here has been, people here are much more open to that. And if we speak about, embedded racism, I see that. I see it largely as the white wealthy who access MAiD. And it's tricky, I think, in how do we remain open to other community groups without pushing or encouraging at the same time. I find it is delicate and it requires a lot of listening. And so my experience with MAiD is that it really emphasizes personal autonomy, and it involves a lot of listening because it's so unique how people experience suffering. And so it's been a lot of learning, a lot of listening, in a very privileged position to be a MAiD assessor.
Mm-hmm. And for someone who has never heard of MAiD, how do you describe it to them? How do you start that conversation?
That's a bit of a tricky question. I think it's difficult to remember that because MAiD has been such a large portion of my life and career for the past 10 years. And so I almost forget that. I think, what is MAiD? I think MAiD is kind of enacting personal autonomy and to allow someone to remain in control over how their end of life looks. I see, even if people don't actually move forward and receive the medical assistance in dying procedure, I see immense relief in being deemed eligible after an assessment, the relief in period to know, things are not great and things are difficult, but I'm in control. And empowering them, as I said, is such a privilege because I see the relief in their eyes. And it really lets them put death and dying aside temporarily because that's a box that they've checked. They've got a plan and they are in control of that. And to see people be able to now put that aside and live their good days and enjoy their good days is really wonderful to see.
Mm-hmm. Have you faced any, controversy, pushback or, struggles with it?
Yeah. I think part of my move out here was related to that. I had just completed a relationship at that time, and so it was an opportunity to make a change. I moved out to Victoria on March 21st of 2020, so about the day lockdown started. And so to see how different it was between Ontario and here, and to move here with such a robust community of practice, that has been really great, because I really didn't have a community of practice in Ontario. This was something that colleagues were not necessarily doing. And so it was difficult to debrief with people and say, this was my experience today. And because certainly I don't want to intrude on my patient's experience. And so I keep myself separate and apart, and kind of deal with that on my own later. But I really didn't have a community where I could talk about that and work through that. And so part of my move here was because my community of support was here. You ask about my experience of conflict. For a little while, I was the MAiD guy in Ontario, and I would get stares. I got hate mail, anonymous hate mail early on, and it was both disappointing and a little bit scary. There was a hint of some personal safety issues that people who are in emotional situations do and say things they might not otherwise do and say when the emotions are heightened. And so I did keep that in mind, but it was quite scary. That period where I began MAiD work was the end of my participation in social media, because it created vulnerability. And I had seen colleagues and friends get dragged in the media, and I saw how much that disrupted their life and practice. And the work is so important to me that I didn't want to move away from the work, but I didn't want to make myself a target either. And so that kind of led to me stepping away from publicity. And so I did see that. Fortunately, I feel much more appreciated and much safer on the West Coast. But I do hope that things have continued, and I believe they have. I do believe they have improved across Canada. And there's always two sides. And so I do see that coming up again with what's happening in Alberta. So it's still present for sure.
So what's happening in Alberta?
So Alberta has proposed and approved a new bill, Bill 18, that changes a number of aspects to the MAiD eligibility process and who can access MAiD. And so it has created additional requirements for people. And so one of them, for example, is they have a prognosis of less than 12 months to live. That is incredibly difficult to specify. And I think that those additional barriers aren't necessarily safeguards, and they don't necessarily focus on patients' lived experience. And so I am keenly watching what's happening in Alberta right now to see how that impacts access. I think being in BC, I do wonder if we'll start to see people leaving Alberta to come to BC to access MAiD that's no longer available to them. I also see the distress in my colleagues working in Alberta. There's a new fear of the new requirements and safeguards. There's a new fear in providers of the scrutiny on the work that they're doing. And I think the whole country is watching carefully what's happening in Alberta. And I think we need to come together as a population, as Canadians, to say, well, wait a second. Is that really the true belief of the people?
Well, do you have to say that, I'm really sad to hear that you've suffered that way because of, your support and your participation in the MAiD process. The idea that I I don't know, I've kind of coined it as weaponized Christianity. It's people making choices because of what they believe to be right. Um, it just makes it difficult. Again, you're entirely correct when it comes to personal autonomy, because there was a sense of relief when I made that decision. And it wasn't necessarily that I was even going to be able to use MAiD, because, we don't have a lot of choice at the end of our life. And sometimes things happen regardless of whatever your plans are. As somebody who has sat with a number of people at the end of their life, not in the sense that you have, but in a way that you get to have those conversations, in a way that you get to be a part of the end of someone's journey, feels like such a privilege. Because sitting with my mother, sitting with my sister, sitting with my brother, and you're very protective of that energy around them, of just filling them with a million I love yous, and hope they carry that with them on their journey. One of the things you brought up was, white wealth, and how you know, that seems to be the people who use MAiD, wealthy white people. It's the same thing with everything. With absolutely everything. I couldn't get onto the clinical study for this miracle drug I'm on now, but guess who got it? The wealthy white folk who lived close to the hospitals, who, could fulfill that narrow window of criteria. And so, yeah, that was part of the reason when we started this podcast. It was around my experience with MAiD, and applying for it, and researching it. And well, as Danielle brought up, 94% of the people who use MAiD are Caucasian. And so we ended up asking the question, why? Why? Because they feel like they have more agency? Because they feel like that, I don't know. And then the answer became more and more complex. From the racism that still exists in Canada. I mean, people like to think that it doesn't exist anymore, but it's out there. It's out there. If you read the recent study out of Quebec, that they're still sterilizing Indigenous women? Oh, for God's sakes. Where is the humanity? Because I was shocked when I first heard last season that, sterilization used to be fairly common. If an Indigenous woman went into a hospital, for whatever reason, they would automatically sterilize them. I heard this firsthand from a head nurse at a regional hospital. That was just offhandedly told me that this is what they do. And then to find out the last time, what did they say? 2018 was the last time they've known of it, and yet now here comes a recent study of Indigenous women being sterilized. So why don't we trust the medical system? Why don't we use MAiD? Because it's not safe. And that's a big generalization, because I was happy to report, after my brother had passed away, We had talked about him in our last episode of last season and his medical battle he was going through. And the hospital was amazing. They held so much room for our cultural beliefs. And so, you get hope, and then you hear another story. And then you get hope, and then you hear another story. It's difficult.
What you say, Mary, I am so hopeful. I hope that in the future this continues to improve, and I really do have genuine hope for that. Being a member of the queer community, I can say to you both, you have allies, which are so important for the queer community, and it improved for that group. MAiD work has provided me the immense opportunity of speaking to queer people who are much older than I am, who are in their 90s, and has given me the phenomenal opportunity to thank them for the suffering they endured that made my life so much easier. And I'm so hopeful with that history that the Indigenous population can experience something like that because you have allies. And I really hope that that's possible as well. And I will keep standing with you to hopefully continue to move the needle so that that doesn't continue happening.
Well, I appreciate that. I definitely appreciate that. But if you look at the resurgence of racism, just out and out racism,
Yeah.
it's difficult there. But if we're talking specifically around medical racism, then we have to break it down into manageable chunks.
Mhm.
Because we have these racist organizations starting in BC. We have racist, MLAs and MPs. We have racist doctors who have come out. And, it's I do hold hope, but it almost has to be on an individual basis so that each person can advocate on their own behalf or have someone advocating for them. And you're entirely correct. I think it comes from supporters. It comes from people who believe. And, I think we have to become more and more vocal in standing with other people, not with just our own beliefs, but with other people. So I'm glad you've seen that change, and I'm glad that you've been able to thank them for walking through that strife. Because for me, there's a lot of when it comes to just out and out racism, there's a lot of survivor's guilt there because I didn't suffer the way my grandparents did, the way my parents did. But when it comes to medical racism, so they just recently settled the class action lawsuit against Indian hospitals. Do you know what was taken off the table? Anything medical. You couldn't get any kind of compensation for anything medical, and I guarantee they did medical experiments on them. So, yeah, we try really hard not to lose hope, and we don't, because you have to look at it at an individual level.
Yeah. No.
And so when it comes to MAiD, it's one at a time. Everything we do just has to be one person at a time. That we're trying to shift their perspective. That even if you don't agree with MAiD, and that much like the same, queer thing comment that was made years and years ago, you don't like gay people, you don't like gay marriage, don't marry one. It's the same thing. You don't like MAiD, well, don't use it. But don't take away somebody else's, you know, autonomy in the process.
No, and all throughout season 1, there was a common theme of how do you deal with this? We talked to doctors, we talked to lawyers, we talked to professors, and they're dealing with such systemic issues. that it's so cyclical. How do you deal with it? How do you deal with, issues that I thought we dealt with this. I thought we were past this. Or, even as, a patient or caregiver, you know, we talk a lot about self-care. We talk a lot about how do we take care of ourselves in the midst of pain, in the midst of trauma, and you even mentioned, how do you debrief even in your own circles? Like, how do you make this sustainable for you? Because 10 years, wow, that's an amazing, time commitment to this. So how do you do it?
Thank you for that question. It has definitely been an evolution over that time. I think a community of practice or community of support, empathy is so powerful. So people who understand your experience can be so validating and helpful. And so I really did find that community of support totally invaluable to me. And as I mentioned, that was one of the draws to move out here, because essentially joining CAMAP, which is the group that supports assessors and providers, they were based in Victoria. That was a big draw for me because I had no community of practice really in Ontario. And so that was certainly so helpful to me. And in my role on the board of directors, I've taken over the case sharing group for the last 4 years. And so it's, again, been a huge privilege to be able to oversee that and support my community that provided me support from the beginning. I think in terms of other self-care activities, I'm surrounded by plants, lots of plants outside as well. Plants have been a great peaceful area of play for me, really. So certainly community, hobbies. MAiD has been very helpful in gaining perspective on my own values. I see what is important to people at their end of life when they're really prioritizing things the most, and prioritizing joy is so important. And so MAiD has really, that's one of the things it's taught me, is to prioritize joy and prioritize people who are important to me. I think also it's shifted interests. And so, I mean, when I was quite a bit younger, I would watch dramas and true crime things. And so practicing MAiD has really diminished my capacity for negativity. And so it's been interesting, the shift in the media in that I consume. I don't consume much negative fictional media anymore because I see such challenging situations in real life. Like I get to see what real problems look like regularly. And it's, again, that privilege to give my head a shake and remember when I'm upset about something trivial, like, Don, you know what real problems look like. Like, get over it. Which is not something everyone gets to experience and gets that kind of reminder all the time. And so I'm really appreciative that the work allows me to have that.
Well, I do have to say, though, Don, that those issues you do have aren't diminished because of other people's issues. Hold space for yourself. Because there aren't always just life and death big picture things. And I think what you did say about creating a soft place to land is incredibly important because of the work that you do. That gives you longevity in this job because, otherwise you wouldn't have lasted 10 years. So I love the fact that you find joy in plants.
Well, thank you. I certainly appreciate that.
But the evolution of MAiD, 10 years is a long time. Where do you see this going? Like, what do you still want to work on as yourself, but also what changes do you want to see, shifts?
I have to say, I felt very hopeful, maybe a little more hopeful than I feel right at this very moment because of what's happened in Alberta. I have colleagues in Alberta who are very distressed about this option being taken away from people. And so that's kind of been a reality check for me. If you had have asked me that question 2 years ago, I think my answer would have been a little bit different. I do think that over the last 10 years, the conversations we have are much more prevalent. Certainly, before this podcast, there hasn't really been a look publicly into how Indigenous people experience this aspect of the healthcare system, at least not that I know of. And so I really do think by inviting people into your own lives, it really allows people to see a different perspective. And so, really, so important. Because you're right, we're not talking about this very much. And the Indigenous experience, that's not my story to tell. And so I think that what you're doing is so valuable to people to share your own experience and thoughts, because that, similar to how I didn't have that empathy when I started doing this work, I feel you're filling that need for Indigenous people, because I don't know where else they would go to learn of your unique experience. And so I think that that is so important.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I honestly believe that's sort of key to why we're doing this. As it happened, we were having these conversations anyways. And as
Mhm.
people with a film and television background, and I actually started in radio, it just seemed like maybe this was a bigger conversation that should be shared with other people. And so thank you. I appreciate that.
I think that we need to hear more from patients, because I think that part of the story is missing in a lot of what we see. And to be fair, I mean, it's difficult to rally so much energy to share a story when you're approaching the end of your life. Like, that's a huge ask to now devote time and energy into sharing your story. But it's so important because it's patients' stories that help other people understand why this is important, why autonomy is important, and sharing your rationale for why you came to your decision shed some light on that, because we hear about policy and process and we can lose individual stories. And so I think, I think that that's so important.
I think you're entirely correct. I like the idea of narrative pedagogy, of teaching through storytelling. And as an Indigenous person, that's how we taught. There's a
Mhm.
reason Indigenous pedagogy is completely different than what's taught in school, because we learn differently. And if you do it through narrative pedagogy, what that does is it allows you to reach each of your students where they are. They'll get what they need from that. And, when it comes to teaching somebody, you have to meet people where they are. You're not gonna preach at them. You're not gonna talk at them. People don't listen don't learn that way. But if you're gonna tell them a story and they're gonna pick and choose what they're gonna learn from that moment, and then I guarantee you, you tell them that same story later, they're gonna get something else from it. And that's what the most powerful stories do. So, as an Indigenous person, I've heard some stories hundreds of times. And then every once in a while, I go, click, oh, wait, there was something else there. And I think it's important. So I really appreciate the way you teach, because
I
you and I earlier were talking about being academics who don't like reading. don't like books
Yes.
because I have to read it like 3 or 4 times.
I think it's so interesting you mentioned that. So that is one of the first statements in my teaching philosophy. As an academic, we need to create a dossier. And my teaching philosophy is, in a large part, narrative pedagogy. And so I think it's interesting you bring that up. I find teaching by telling stories so meaningful to me. I pretty much remember every one of my patients that I've worked with, because they all have unique stories. My kind of entrance into academia was over COVID, so that was difficult. But I really did look into what resources were available to me. And one of them was learning about different types of teaching. And that's how I discovered I was a narrative pedagogist. And also how, in line with my own understandings and what worked for me, the Indigenous strategy in education is. And so another thing I found so helpful was coming together as a group. And I learned that that's called circle work. And I learned about the importance of the circle, creating a group of equals. There's always room for more. And that resonated so well with me. And that is something I've really tried to incorporate in my practice as an educator, to create that space. I think also unique in the NP program is that my students come in to the program as mid-career professionals, and they all have such a unique wealth of expertise and experience in different areas that I don't have. And so I really, truly feel that circle and how we are all equals and we all learn from each other, and how important it is to hold space for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so certainly things I didn't know that I didn't know, but certainly appreciate knowing now, and how helpful they've been in developing my own teaching.
Yeah,
I
it's
gotta say,
definitely an important process, because however, there's a cost that comes with sharing these stories. I really appreciate, your insight into how you experienced this podcast, because it almost didn't happen for season 2, at least for me, because there is an emotional cost that comes with doing this work. I realize how important it is to build and maintain this platform, these conversations, because we never wanted this to be an answer. We wanted this to be a platform to ask questions, to keep the conversations going, and to normalize talking about difficult topics, different themes, things that are impacting us, on a national level, on a community level, on a family level, and on a patient level. But with sharing all of that, it almost broke me.
Yeah.
That's why we talk about self-care, because being genuine to this experience, being authentic in this journey, means offering parts of ourselves that it hurts. There's a sacrifice, And so I appreciate all of our journeys and all of our work that help maintain this, because the work that you do, emphasizing the importance of, sharing those stories, creating that sense of identity in any industry that we're in. So thank you. Yeah.
I raise my hands to you, because absolutely that is so valid. As you approach end of life, you only have a finite amount of energy, as we all do. And devoting so much energy to this podcast and sharing this experience is certainly a legacy. This is filling a huge gap. There's nothing like what you've created available to people right now. And so I think that this is going to be so helpful for so many people, not just Indigenous people, but people in general experiencing such a difficult challenge as they approach end of life, and to be so vulnerable and open with your experiences consumes so much energy. And so thank you for that gift to people.
Yeah, thank you. Because we wanted to normalize talking about death and dying, because, in our communities, there are beautiful practices, beautiful traditions that have sustained us and our families for thousands of years. It wasn't something to be hidden, in the basement of a hospital. It was something to be dealt with as a community, as families. Each one of us had roles and continue to have roles when someone is sick, when someone is dying, and even after they've died, after they've passed. And we wanted to shed some light on that, because it's not something to be hidden away. These conversations are difficult, but they are necessary, to reclaim parts of our culture that we've lost, to learn about traditions that have been forgotten. Because we start conversations and then people are like, oh, it sparked a memory. It's like, oh, my grandparents used to do that. Or, like I said, this isn't the answer. This is the starting point. My mom always used to say, we can't fix what we don't acknowledge. And we need to acknowledge the issues that are still happening, still occurring in our clinics, in our hospitals, with doctors, with nurses. So while we should maintain hope, it still doesn't fix the issues that we're still dealing with. Even Ministry of Health has released a survey asking Indigenous people to talk about their experiences in, medical facilities. Like, what have you been dealing with in your doctor's office? What have you been dealing with in your hospital? Because they realize it's still an issue. And health, taking care of ourselves physically is hard enough. We should be receiving the care, the treatment, and the support we need when we go to the hospital. But what that means is that, we even had this conversation with Dr. Sandel. Before we even get to the clinic, before we even get to the hospital, we'll have this thought in the back of our minds. Will they treat me as a human? Will they treat me as someone worthwhile? Or will they hurt me? Will they not believe my pain? And these are all of the conversations that we're having. And so how do we make space for that?
Thank you for sharing that, Danielle. I think that's such a burden to carry, but so important. I think we absolutely can't forget the history, because we see how history repeats itself if we forget it, certainly. And so it is so important. And I feel so disappointed that people still come to the healthcare system feeling like that. Because when you're feeling unwell and vulnerable, to then question if that will be believed, I can't imagine how discouraging that must feel.
Mm-hmm. And it is encouraging to hear about, certain universities, colleges that are starting to incorporate, Indigenous, not only Indigenous teachings, but Indigenous history in, health. So, does do you do any of that work, or does your college? How do they how do they address that?
That's a great question. I think the university is trying. We are trying to invite and incorporate Indigenous people into leadership positions to do a better job at that. I personally struggle with that because I am very worried I will be assuming an experience that I didn't have. And so I do really try and use the things that I'm learning from Indigenous peoples, kind of pedagogical philosophy in that wasn't my area. And so learning about those different ways of knowing and ways of educating has been really eye-opening to me. I think that we're really trying to incorporate the Indigenous lens into teaching in all areas of healthcare. We have Indigenous focus seats in the program because of the disparity in opportunity. And we do have Indigenous students. I struggle to find an appropriate word. I'm encouraged by the interest of some of my Indigenous students in working in an area of end of life or with MAiD. I really do feel that we need people with those lived experience to be doing this work also to help shape it for that population, because anything that I incorporate into my practice is through other people. And I think those various lived experiences are so important in incorporating that. And I do struggle because I haven't had those experiencing anti-Indigenous racism. But I certainly acknowledge that they're there and try and share my understanding of them in ways we can approach that in a more understanding and accepting lens. Because you're right, it's a big gap. And I think we're going to have to continue working on it for the rest of my career and probably for generations to really continue undoing what has been done in the past. And so having a good understanding of that history is where we need to start. And I do see that we're starting to do that, and I hope that we continue.
Hmm. Well, yeah, I think so too. And I think it's really, really important. Like Danielle said, I truly believe you can't fix what you don't acknowledge. And many people try to ignore life, ignore the difficult things. That until you stand face to face to something, you have no hope of fixing it. So, when it even comes to as a practitioner, what does culturally safe MAiD look like to you?
What a great question. I think approaching people in general with openness, with an invitation to incorporate what is meaningful and important to that person into that process. And not just Indigenous people, but any person. Everyone has their own unique lived experience, and incorporating that into end of life is very important. And so I feel that incorporating Indigenous traditions and practices is important, and that exposure also helps us all have a better understanding. And as I mentioned, I never realized that I connected well with some of these Indigenous philosophies and principles until I had that exposure, and then realized, oh, that is really in line with my own experience. And I had just never put it together before. And I hope others can have similar experiences where they are exposed to different practices, and it opens up their world a little bit to understand things from different perspectives. And so that is kind of the framing I approach it with.
Wow. Well, Danielle had touched on it, but I tend to think that Indigenous people do a few things really, really well. And one of which is death and dying and that whole process around that, because we have ceremony, we have tradition. And we also have roles, like Danielle said, that you just automatically step into. And some of the traditions we have, as a documentary filmmaker, I'd love to make a documentary around sort of the whole death and dying process within Indigenous nations. But, I think it's important that when we're having these discussions, that, we speak to the people who are providing these services. So, as a healthcare provider, how can we make it so that they better understand Indigenous concerns around MAiD? Because that was sort of the big question we asked. Why are Indigenous people not using MAiD? But how do we get healthcare providers to better understand our concerns?
I think appointing Indigenous people to positions of leadership, to listening to Indigenous people's experiences, even listening to some of your own experience. I'm just heartbroken with, like, how could that have been your experience? How disappointing and how embarrassing for the healthcare system that has happened. And so I think it really is the sharing stories and listening to people's experiences, because it's pretty hard to challenge someone's lived experience. Like, that was what they lived. How can you challenge that or dispute it or minimize it? Like, that was the experience, and we need to listen to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but what we consider common sense is not actually that common, right? So
Yeah.
when we have these conversations, when we share our stories, when we bear our trauma to the world, we will still get naysayers. We will still get people who say, no, you made it up. Or even worse, they acknowledge it happen. And they say it happened a long time ago. Get over it.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's not just dealing with the healthcare system, it's dealing with the public, it's dealing with, you know, racists in the public, it's dealing with misogynists in the public, it's dealing with a lot of people who don't want to hear your story, And so how do we build those processes? How do we build those bridges of connection between, colleges, universities, hospitals, where it's not just a siloed experience between that particular hospital or that particular college? How do we make connection? How do we make healing universal?
Taking a step back from, or to the statement you said, it's happened, it's done, get over it. That is so short-sighted, because that history is embedded into the people it affected, and then it ripples out into their children and their children's children. And we talk about concepts of epigenetics, where the environmental exposures are incorporated into people. And unfortunately, I think that given the length and history that's happened, I unfortunately feel it will probably be generations before we really start to see true change and resolution of some of these issues. I think for now, it's just focusing on continued progress, continued learning from other people's experiences, and to not forget that history, because, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, once we forget the history, we keep doing the same mistakes over and over again.
Mm-hmm. No, it's true. It's true. It was funny that you brought up epigenetics, because I was going to mention that, it's going to take a long time for us to heal from this
Yeah.
because of epigenetics. Because, I've seen my own children react to things that they weren't ever exposed to. And yet their reaction was just so visceral. It was just, it made me believe in epigenetics and sort of the effect that it has on it. But, let's take a step back and, the whole process of MAiD and, the application of it, and then you go through the assessment. What happens if a family member disagrees?
That creates a very challenging situation. I think there is, to a certain extent, an opportunity. And so there is an opportunity to have a productive conversation between the person pursuing MAiD and the family member that disagrees. I think there's an opportunity there for some resolution between them. I think in terms of the legal aspects, the person who disagrees doesn't have a legal say of what happens. However, the disruption and barriers they can put up certainly do impact that person. So even though they don't have legal authority to make a decision on someone's behalf, their actions and behaviors can certainly impact how someone accesses medical assistance in dying. And I also find that as people approach end of life, their energy is finite. And so sometimes people pursuing MAiD decide, I don't have the energy in me to fight or to disagree with this person. They're important to me, and I don't have the reserve of energy to go through that disagreement. And so they don't. And so I think there's so much context and so much unique views and experiences within families. That's a very tricky thing to navigate. And I think it's all about the support networks people have. Is that possible? And I mentioned that in acknowledging the energy this podcast must take to create, to put so much of yourselves into it. Like that takes a lot of energy and a lot of reserve. And so I think we just need to continue focusing on having open dialogues, to listening to each other, because I think the whole underlying theme of MAiD and the thing that is so important and resonates so much with me is the importance of personal autonomy. I see how beneficial that is, how meaningful that can be to people, and how important that is to people to maintain. And I see the relief in people's eyes when I say, you're eligible. We go through the process of assessment and I say, okay, I find you eligible. The sigh of relief that this is one less thing on their list that they need to do. And that, there's a plan for that. And so I can put that aside for now and focus on the other things in my life, because MAiD is only one small portion of people's lives. And I think that it consumes so much energy and so much space in people's minds while it's uncertain and unresolved. I think giving that autonomy back to people is such a privilege, because I see the relief in their eyes. And that's really been so meaningful in my career. I never experienced the gratitude in working in emergency and trauma. That was my nursing career prior to becoming a nurse practitioner. I never experienced that gratitude in that environment as I did in doing work in people who are approaching end of life.
Yeah. Yeah. Don, can I ask something of you? You can say no.
Okay.
But in your previous experience as a MAiD practitioner, can you walk me through what it looks like?
Like what an assessment looks like?
No, not the assessment, but what the actual practice is. So if you can remember sort of those moments.
A clarifying question. Do you mean at the procedure itself, like giving
Yes,
the medications?
yes.
Okay. Again, I feel, sure, I can walk you through that. So after an assessment has been done and things are moving forward as the person has planned, I really take their lead. There are certain safeguards we need to be mindful of. So, of course, ensuring consent, and there's processes for that, ensuring there's a final signature in that. But I invite people to incorporate their own beliefs and values into that process. I think meaning making, when I started doing this work, that wasn't something I considered as much. It was working with spiritual care practitioners in my old organization that really opened my eyes to the benefit that those practices and traditions have. I think MAiD itself, on the day of and leading up to, I think there's such an opportunity there. There's what I would call productive grieving, where you can say the thing that you wanted to say but hesitated to for the last 10 years, or apologize for the thing that has been kind of a stitch in people's sides, or kind of a conflict, a subconscious conflict in people's relationships for the last period of time. It creates an opportunity to resolve those things. And I think that is so beneficial, not only for the person pursuing MAiD at the end of their life, but to their family, and to invite them to be present for that. And so back to your question, Marion, what does that process look like? So it's certainly incorporating their beliefs and values. It's certainly making sure you're adhering to the safeguards in the legislated process of ensuring consent. And then incorporating all of those meaning-making activities that are important to the people. And so I like to keep my position in the corner and try and keep out of the way of all that the social aspects and productive grieving of the family. I mean, I'm certainly present because I'm there in the room. I have my medications, which are pretty conspicuous, like there are a lot of large syringes, but I really try and minimize my presence to stay out of the way so that people can create the experience that they feel they would benefit most from. Does that answer your question a little?
Oh, it kind of does, and it kind of doesn't. And I guess it's what's the most beautiful thing you've witnessed?
So beautiful things I've witnessed is, I guess, kind of enacting what I was more vaguely describing. So to hear the apology, and the privilege of being able to hear people's last words to their loved one, to their teammate in life, their partner. I don't know anyone else who gets to hear those things and be present for those things. So I'm very aware that that's a very unique and privileged perspective.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm looking at is, like I said, I've been with people at the end of their journey, and with my sister,
Mm-hmm.
it was one of the most beautiful things I've witnessed. We sat with her, and we told her all those things that and she was even joking. She was making jokes. And the thing about pulmonary hypertension is that, and the human body is such an amazing thing, is that, while her body was shutting down and her heart was pumping enough blood to keep her brain We had a conversation with her 20 minutes before she died. And there's beauty at the end of somebody's life. And I think that's part of what people fail to acknowledge is what a beautiful ending. And it sounds horrible to say, but even a beautiful death that can occur because you're living so authentically that you're saying the I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry you're saying the million I love yous. And I wish we could live that way.
Mm-hmm.
But because death is imminent, that people have a different energy. And I can imagine, like, I don't know what it's like to be in your position. But I truly believe that there is beauty at the end. When you have those moments that you can say what you have to say. And I guess the question was, what's the most beautiful thing that you've witnessed?
Well, I will first of all say I will try and keep those sacred things that I've witnessed, the specifics, confidential, because that's a privileged position to be in. And so I'll describe it kind of more as an overview. I've seen people say the last things to their loved ones. I call them their life's teammate. I heard in your podcast you call that you're in a one life stand with your partner. I like that. And so I am privileged to hear those last things, the reassurances, A, B, and C, don't worry about those issues. I will continue your mission to look after them. A lot of reassurance. There's a lot of uncertainty because even people who are spiritual, we don't have any solid evidence, or most of us don't, to say this is what you can expect in the dying process. People don't have the opportunity to come back and share those with us, those experiences. And so I've witnessed a lot of variations of that. I think the most beautiful aspect to me are the takeaways that I get. And so I get to see the value of resolving some of those things. I think certainly to keep an open dialogue is critically important for people. I think it is important to me that I excuse myself when needed. And so I always offer to excuse myself. After I get the final signature, I say, I'm going to step out for a moment. I don't necessarily ask them, would you like me to step out? Because I find people say, oh, no, I don't need that. And so I say, I'm going to step out for a moment. When you're ready, you can send X loved one out to get me. I'll just be outside. And I excuse myself to create a bit of privacy because I don't ever want to leave feeling like I didn't give that opportunity. Because that is kind of the epitome almost of productive grieving, to have those important moments. And so as an overview, I think those opportunities, though the resolution of things is so valuable and beautiful to witness. The things I do see in person and the things that are on the other side of the door that I've excused myself for, I think that's such a wonderful opportunity.
No, I appreciate that answer. It's I think I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've said that. I do these interviews where I try to get the emotion of somebody out of the interview. And I understand you have to hold space for, that's their story to tell. That you've separated yourself from that. So I guess maybe the question would be, what have you learned about love from families going through this experience?
That it's so multifaceted. I think I will also say there's a lot of mirroring. And what I mean by that is I try and really read the room, because sometimes I go in and it's a very sad experience and people are very sad. I don't try and disrupt that, because that is what that person's experience is in the moment. But other times I go in and it's a party. There's laughing. There is a sushi boat. There is music. And there's some people dancing outside. And to see the diversity in people's end of life experiences is really beautiful. I certainly understand why some people would be so sad in losing someone that's important to them. And then I'm amazed at how beautiful and meaningful and happy some people's experience can be. And so really, I think the takeaway there is to not necessarily have expectations going into it. It really is to read the room. I'm a guest in this experience. I am, providing a certain aspect, I guess, the service to it, but I'm really a guest to the overall experience. And I try to minimize my interference with that while still meeting my obligations, the legal, the ethical aspects.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I have, a two-part question, like for before and after, when it comes to the loved ones, when it comes to the family, when it comes to the caregivers. Before, they go through with MAiD, what advice do you have for families, loved ones, caregivers to medically advocate for that? Like, if this patient has said, yes, I want MAiD, I want to go through with the assessment, what does that process look like? What questions should they ask? Because we've heard of other people ask for it, but then it was too late,
I think,
or other barriers like lost paperwork. Like it was, how do families, loved ones, caregivers medically advocate for their loved one who wants MAiD?
that is a difficult question, but a great question. I think, and I've seen that happen before. So my doctoral work was about delirium, kind of fluctuating, impaired levels of consciousness. And so it developed a comfort to assess capacity, especially in people with dementia. And so that tends to be the type of person that I see so closely aligned with what you're describing. And part of the challenge is that legally, a substitute decision maker has no input in the MAiD process. And so they can make the connection in their advocacy, but they can't do the eligibility assessment. They can't answer the questions because MAiD has to be a decision and choice made by a person with capacity to make it. And so sometimes I see exactly what you're describing. Someone's been advocating for that person for a year, maybe 2 years. And by the time it finally happens, the opportunity is gone because they no longer have capacity. And that's really difficult to experience for them because they feel like they weren't successful in doing the thing that they felt was their responsibility. And so for me, when that happens, I try and leave space for their experience. Like I appreciate that this is what they wanted. And I really do try and bring out aspects of the eligibility assessment that acknowledge their efforts. And so, for example, if someone tells me I'm not experiencing intolerable suffering because they have dementia and they no longer appreciate their suffering, the thing that they were worried about, they no longer can recognize is happening. And they deny to me, that's not causing me suffering. And so I try and bring the family, the caregivers' attention to those aspects. And so I think you've really done such a great job in advocating for your loved one. Unfortunately, based on what they're telling me today, that they're not experiencing intolerable suffering makes them ineligible today. However, I think there is also the takeaway that this person is telling us they're no longer experiencing intolerable suffering. And that's something to really be mindful of. I think that that is an aspect worth focusing on, because you're right, people do feel very disappointed if someone's found ineligible after such a long road in trying to attain the goal, the eligibility assessment, because it can be so disappointing and so detrimental to their identity as the caregiver and as the advocate, because they know that the person's been saying this for 1, 2, 10 years, and now here we are and it can't happen. And so I think leaving space for acknowledging the person's efforts in advocating on their loved one's behalf, and then also explaining why legally that can't happen.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, the next part of the question is after, if someone has used MAiD,
Mhm.
what supports or resources are in place for the people left behind? Because that's a part of death and dying that's the most difficult is, in our beliefs, our loved one isn't truly gone. They're on, a spiritual plane,
Mhm.
but it's still us left behind. We're still the ones left feeling the loss. And, as someone who is going to support my mom, who supports anyone who makes this choice, it's still grief, and there's even the years leading up to it, there's the anticipatory grief. Well, are there any supports in place for the loved ones left behind?
I think you've raised a very good point and identified a gap. Certainly, the way healthcare is structured with funding, most of the supports are tied to the person pursuing MAiD. And unfortunately, when that person dies from MAiD, a lot of those supports evaporate because they're tied to the person who has now passed away. And so you've identified an area where there's still certainly room for growth and development. I think leaning on and relying on the expertise of the bereavement supports we do have. So spiritual care is one. I'm personally not a very spiritual person. However, I have witnessed such immense benefit that people and families get from working through those things with someone who has a good understanding of different supports and different resources and different spiritual openness to allow that. And so I see the immense benefit there. I think there are some organizations that can be very supportive. So certainly here in BC, our healthcare system is broken into health authorities or separated into health authorities. I think to explore the unique resources available within your health authority, and the MAiD program is an excellent place to reach out to access those. And your MAiD assessors and providers are also good resources to make that connection. I think working within Island Health, I'm privileged to have experts that I work with who are able to provide those supports. So I have a colleague named Oceana who's been doing this work for many years and has such a wealth of expertise and experience in providing this care. I think those are great avenues. There are other organizations. Dying with Dignity is one. Bridge C14, MAiD Family Support Group, because there is a bit of a gap in my own role as an assessor provider. I tend not to continue working with families and loved ones after the MAiD has been provided, because that's not outlined in my role. Of course, patients and their families have my contact information, and I'm happy to make those referrals if they've initially declined them and then later change their mind. I'm happy to do that, and I invite them to contact me to do that. But I'm so appreciative of the other resources available, because, as I said, when the person passes away, a lot of the things that are tied to them also go away.
I really want to, tell you, I really appreciate you being so compassionate and caring in your role. You know, it, I'm sure it made a huge impact to anyone you were part of their MAiD experience. So thank you. And for anyone who's interested in becoming a nurse practitioner or working with end of life, what would you tell them? What lessons would you share?
That's a great question. I think if you have an interest, I think people with an interest tend to make the best assessors, providers, support people because they're engaged. And so I certainly would say, if you're a healthcare provider and interested in moving into the MAiD work, certainly explore what resources are available to you. CAMAP, as I mentioned, the Canadian Association for Medical Assistants in Dying Assessors and Providers, a great organization. I was fortunate to be invited onto the team of creators to create the Canadian MAiD curriculum, which is available through CAMAP, and it was sponsored by Health Canada. It is a great program to go through all kinds of different aspects of the MAiD process. And so it's essentially broken into 8 modules, 7 technically, with the 8th interwoven into the others. And it essentially goes over a lot of the big concepts of MAiD. And so there's the history of MAiD that's open to the general public, clinical conversation. So how do you actually talk about this and respond when asked about it? There's a 3rd module on conducting MAiD assessment, so going through each of the components of the assessment. There's an additional module on assessing capacity and vulnerability, because capacity is critical in ensuring someone is able to provide informed consent. And so it goes through the components of what makes capacity. And then it also focuses on how to approach and to ensure safeguards are used in protecting vulnerable people without blocking their access entirely to MAiD, because some opponents of MAiD feel that the best protection is to prohibit their access, which I don't agree with. There's a module on providing MAiD, because again, it's an artful process. Like, yes, there is a clinical logistical process to go through, but to do that with tact and respect is paramount, because it's such a vulnerable time for people when emotions are so heightened. And so there is a module focused on what that specific part of the process looks like. There is a module on navigating complex cases. And then there has been a reiterated module about MAiD and mental health, because that's kind of been on the horizon for a while now. There's been a lot of energy into looking and planning for that, even though it hasn't happened yet. It's still a critically important aspect of this care that we need to be cognizant of. And then the 8th module that I had mentioned that's interwoven in the others is about self-care and resilience. And interestingly, after the modules were all created, it was decided we really need to take the 8th module and incorporate it into the others, because feedback and experience suggested that the healthcare providers wouldn't take that module unless it was interwoven into the others, because it tends to be a feature of healthcare providers to put their own resilience and self-care to the side. And so it was interwoven. In terms of approaching that in newer healthcare providers, and so teaching in the nurse practitioner program, it is an incredibly dense program because it covers so much. But we do touch on it. And so just because it's such an important aspect of my career, I do have a lecture on MAiD. But given the program is so packed with curriculum, it is quite brief. It's one part of 1 week in the whole program that's focused on MAiD. And it's 1 week in the program overall that focuses on end-of-life care, including palliative care. And those are such important aspects to care that it is disappointing we don't have more time for it, but we really try and make the time we do have as impactful as possible.
I've got a question then. What changes would you like to see in end-of-life care?
Well, I think I will kind of draw on my experience moving from Ontario to Vancouver Island. I think Vancouver Island is exemplifying that. I think relative to other areas I've worked and practiced, there is a very good infrastructure in place with the MAiD program here. There's a community of practice. There's colleagues I can talk to. We have an annual social event where we try and come together and spend time with each other, because otherwise we tend to work all in our own areas and not talk to each other all that much. There is very good palliative care here. And so that was new to me. When I was working in Ontario, essentially, if you ran into a crisis in the night, you called 911 and went to the hospital. Whereas here we have palliative response teams where there's a number you can call and a nurse will come to your house and assess you. And there's a person they can call that can get access to medication orders in the middle of the night. And I really wish that was more universal, but that tends to be a feature of the island. I also hope that since I've moved here and learned more about how well things are working here, I hope that that's kind of been happening in tandem across the province and in the area that I previously practiced. I hope that similar change and evolution is happening. But in my own experience, the comparison was significant to see the difference. And so I think, coming together as a broader community of practice, we can learn from each other. I chair the National Case Sharing Group with CAMAP. And so those are events. We host them 6 times a year and invite people with challenging cases or interesting cases that others haven't probably experienced. And we come together and we share those cases in a safe community. We do kind of a background screening on our audience. And so you essentially need someone to vouch for you that you are a MAiD provider to create a safe space so people are comfortable sharing those situations, because we really can learn from each other's experiences and we come across things that we would never have expected. And it's important for us to be able to share that with each other so that we can all learn as a community, because the MAiD work can be so siloed and individual that you don't necessarily get to see other experiences. And so seeing and sharing those stories can be so helpful. And that's been a real privilege to be able to lead that group.
I have to say, I love the fact that they have a palliative response team.
Yes.
That sounds amazing, because
Doesn't it?
I looked after my mother. She was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, given 3 months to live, and lived almost 3 years. But she wanted her life to end in the village that I come from, which is only accessible by plane or boat. And, it was so difficult because there were so many policies that wouldn't allow the nurse to come into my parents' house to help me manage her pain. And so we ended up having to take her into the regional hospital because, policy wouldn't allow them to come in and support us in that process. So just the fact that now that a palliative response team exists, wow, that's amazing. Because that had actually affected the outcome of
Mhm.
the end of my mother's life and how she had pictured it happening. So that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I do want to go back. Well, no, before we go back, how about thinking in terms of palliative care, end of life care? How do you think the lessons from that could improve healthcare more broadly?
That's a good question. I think there's potential there. Um, I do feel, and I'm glad to have seen that people sharing negative experiences with me has decreased over time. I did find, especially early on, it was people who had really struggled where there may have been things overlooked. And so I would see people coming to MAiD because of circumstance, because of how things unfolded to them. Over the past 10 years, I've seen that shift gradually into people making this choice, not because they felt backed into a corner to make it, but because it became more socially acceptable to talk about in the last 10 years, that they actually came to decide that that is the route they wanted to pursue without the immense suffering or complications that arose in their care or accessing care. I think as healthcare providers in a strained system, we sometimes see things where, especially over COVID, where cancer screenings were delayed. And so that opportunity of cure was missed because of strain on the system, accessing the system in a very challenging time. And we never really know in cancers, what is the day when cure is no longer possible? Like that's almost impossible for us to know, but it's someday. And the delays over COVID, it's almost impossible to deny that things were delayed. Identifying a cancer was delayed, and so it was no longer treatable. And so I think I have seen, even though the system remains very strained, I have seen improvements there. And so I've seen people accessing MAiD less out of necessity and more out of choice. And then I also have seen gradually the beginnings of our healthcare system getting back on track after such an immense period of strain over COVID, when resources were so thin, and that I've started to see the resolution of that more recently, and I'm certainly appreciative of that.
Hmm. Well, thank you for that answer, but I think it was a little bit off of the question. So
Sure.
the question was, we learned so much about caring for our patients, and
Mm-hmm.
almost, with MAiD, you're thinking about the family also. But, the amount of attention given to the patient on all aspects of, when you talk about spiritual care, you talk about, these conversations that happened prior. I'm just wondering, how do you take that and apply it to the rest of our healthcare system? What can we take from what we've learned from MAiD and apply it in the broader sense to how we're taking care of people? And I believe that will be one of the ways we close that gap when we're saying, why are Indigenous people not using MAiD? Because we don't trust the system. Well, how can we take some of those lessons we learned from being a MAiD practitioner to seeing where MAiD has evolved from? How can we apply that? And what can we apply to the broader healthcare system?
Oh, what a great question. We need you as a consultant asking these tough questions. I think it's challenging. I think one of the, and I appreciate your goal in finding solutions as opposed to identifying more challenges, but I think part of the challenge is how many resources we have for the healthcare system. MAiD is so unique in that I get to go to see a patient in their home Most providers don't get to do that. I get to spend 2 hours with them sitting in their home, learning about them. Like, this is almost unheard of in any other aspect of healthcare. And so I think that humanization is so important and is also a rare opportunity. And so I think, one aspect is certainly improving access to care. I think access is an enormous issue right now. And I see that. I see people, once they get to me, their experience of the healthcare is so different because I can spend 2 hours with them in their assessment. No one else, their oncology team, their heart failure team, that team doesn't get the privilege to go to the patient's home and spend a couple of hours getting to know them. Whereas I do, because I need to understand deep nuances in people's lives. Like, how do they experience suffering? I think time is the greatest privilege of all. I know in listening to one of your early episodes, Marion mentioned, the 10-pound weight limit of being able to hold that. That is, an exemplar aspect of suffering we don't consider. When we think of suffering, we think of pain, nausea, shortness of breath, but not being able to hold your grandchild, that is incredible suffering that is so hard to measure and understand. And so that's why I am fortunate to get the opportunity of time, because I need to uncover those things to understand someone's experience. And so I think the privilege of time would be a great kind of area to focus on how we improve the rest of our healthcare system. But I think that is difficult to achieve given the strain the healthcare system is under right now. And so I don't have a great answer for you, Marion. I think it will be many system changes that are required to allow that to happen.
I honestly believe, though, it's a teachable moment for the rest of the healthcare system as to what is effective. But here's another question then. How do you respond to those who worry that MAiD may become a substitute for better care?
Well, I think the focus there is the person's autonomy and choice. I understand. I appreciate the argument. If we had ideal palliative care, we wouldn't need MAiD. I appreciate that sentiment, but I also don't completely agree with it. I think certainly there's room to improve palliative care, but just the way I described suffering a moment ago about not being able to hold 10 pounds. Well, when you say I can't hold 10 pounds, well, that's trivial. Like, who needs to hold 10 pounds? But when you frame it in a way that you can't hold your grandchildren, that is immensely impactful, and that is immense suffering. And that's something palliative care isn't very good at fixing.
I don't think it's specifically palliative care, though. I think it's like all care. So, you brought up the argument of mental health issues. So, is the people who argue that MAiD could become a substitute for better care in mental health issues, for dementia, for, all of these other things. So rather than try to help heal it, we'll use MAiD. So how do you respond to those who worry that MAiD would be the answer to those questions?
Well, I think it's to be aware of that possibility so that doesn't happen. Because you're right, it could be viewed as a cost-saving strategy. Well, instead of improving that program, we'll do this. But I think it goes back to autonomy and choice. And we need to work in parallel. We need to dramatically improve and bolster other aspects of healthcare, but we don't improve and bolster other aspects of healthcare by blocking access to certain groups for MAiD. It's a both and solution, not a well, to protect you, we need to remove another option.
No, I like that response. I really do, because it's, these are difficult questions that people do, or people ask of us.
Yeah.
And I think it's, we have to respond to both sides.
Yes.
And there are people who don't agree, and there are people who say this is wrong. And I personally have never had anybody, challenge, my eventual use of MAiD. And I appreciate that. But I'm sure there are people who have their own family members,
Mm-hmm.
or even going through the assessment and saying you don't qualify. And that's got to be a heavy burden to carry. That I can't imagine what my response would be if my dad said, no, you can't do it. And, I have my own sort of understanding as to why people say that they don't agree with it. And many times I think, I hate to generalize, but with the Indigenous community, specifically my area, it's primarily sort of the vestiges of organized religion that says it's a sin.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's, I think we have to, ready ourselves for those conversations where people don't agree. That was the only reason I asked that question. It was like, I don't know what it's like to be a MAiD practitioner. I don't know, what people are saying to you, and how do you handle the ethical questions that still challenge you today?
Well, I think you raised an issue that I'm going to touch on. So the people who are embedded or practice organized religion, I've seen different nuances of that. I've seen people who are very well supported in their pursuit of the end of life they choose. And then I also see patients, in my personal experience, it's been patients who are Catholic and have Catholic support networks. I see them dissociate from their support network, which is such a shame, because it's their community, what they've relied on and depended on and supported their entire life. And then the decision to pursue MAiD is so contrary to their beliefs that it forces them to dissociate from their support network in their most vulnerable time. And that's really a shame. Yeah, it's really disappointing to me, because I do see that sometimes. And I also can understand why they choose to dissociate, because they don't have the energy in this stage of their end of life experience. They don't have the energy to defend their decision to every person at every interaction with them. And so they dissociate and they lose their support networks. And I think that that's so disappointing that can happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we wind down this conversation, for our listeners, what misconceptions about MAiD do you want them to know about?
I think one of the things that I see a lot in the media is, cases where things didn't go as planned, or cases where the general experience was quite negative. I will share that as a healthcare provider, I and we are bound by confidentiality. And so even though the experience portrayed in the media by the family, that's genuinely their experience, but the healthcare provider's experience isn't heard, because that goes against patient confidentiality. These are things we can't share, whether it's to defend ourselves or to correct something. We're bound by confidentiality and we can't speak about it. And so it's an uncomfortable and awkward position as a provider to be in. And I'm not saying every action is defensible, because certainly things happen in healthcare where they shouldn't. And I don't expect MAiD would be privileged to not be included in that. But I will say it's important to remember that there are multiple sides to every story. And when it comes to healthcare, the healthcare provider side can't be heard because it jeopardizes confidentiality and privacy. And so that's kind of a big takeaway when looking at the critical aspects of MAiD in the media. I think it's important that we hear all sides so that we can identify harms and risk and be aware of them. But I think we need to be very critical in what we see and read because it's only part of the story.
Yeah. Well, do you have any questions for me or Marion?
I don't think so. I would like to certainly express my gratitude again in you reaching out to invite me on the show. I think it's so important. And I respect you both so much for sharing this very personal experience with so many people, because I think it's the lived experience of people pursuing this that is so important to focus on. It's not about the healthcare providers or the healthcare system necessarily. It is about the people, their autonomy, their right to choose. And so I think it is so wonderful of you to share so vulnerably your own experience. And so I'll thank you for that.
Thank you. How are
Thank
you
you
doing,
very
Mom?
much. I was surprised with how I was triggered by some of this conversation. Death is a difficult thing to talk about. And, I have to remind myself, especially when I'm asking things of my caregivers, of my family, of my loved ones, what it's like to walk in your shoes. And that being supportive of somebody who wants to use MAiD is a difficult burden to carry. That we're asking a lot of our loved ones. But I think many of our loved ones have also come to terms with the fact that our life is about to end regardless. And that being supportive of that process is, an act of love. So thank you very much, Don. I appreciate the conversation. Danielle, how are you?
I'm good. I really appreciated this conversation. It is difficult to talk about, and unless you or your family member have any experience with it, it's difficult to build that community of empathy, of understanding. And having conversations like this is how we, build the bridges of community, a foundation of support. You know, this is what self-care looks like for caregivers. For myself, it's making time for critical thinking. It's making time to have hard conversations with loved ones, and also making sure that we're taking care of ourselves in the process. And what does that look like? It means, all throughout this conversation, this feeling of compassion, this feeling of understanding, this feeling of empathy. There is power in that. There is power in this conversation that we're able to have online from different parts of the world. And I appreciate that. So thank you. I am filled with gratitude, and a lot more thought provoking questions, but that's part of this journey. We never have the answers. We just have more questions, and thank you, Don, for being part of this conversation. So, as always, self care. Figure out how to take care of yourself. Thank you for joining Before I Go.
I have walked through dark and light. I have loved with all my might. Every scar and every mile brought me here. And when the road grows thin, and when the night rolls in, before I go.
Thank you so much for joining us, and take care of yourselves. Self-care is not a choice, it's mandatory. Figure out how to take care of yourself.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope our conversations provided a unique perspective, opened the door to your own discussions, and offer some comfort. If you have any questions or would like to learn more about anything we've discussed or haven't discussed, let us know in the comments. Until next time, at Lugo Doixip Noon. Before I go, gratefully acknowledges the financial support of the Indigenous Screen Office.